You ever notice that the more you grow, the harder things seem to get? Like, you do the work, you read the books, you go to therapy, you start meditating. You become this person who thinks deeply, who reflects, who actually understands why they do what they do. And yet somehow, life feels heavier than it used to. Your oblivious coworker seems completely unbothered. Your friend who never questions anything looks genuinely happy. And you're sitting there, exhausted, wondering if ignorance really was just bliss. If that sounds familiar, stay with me. Because today we're going to talk about something that nobody warns you about when you start doing the inner work. Self awareness has a psychological cost, and understanding that cost is the first step to actually carrying it well. Here are 8 psychological reasons why life genuinely feels harder when you're self aware, and what to do about each one. Reason 1: you can no longer use unconscious defense mechanisms. Before you developed self awareness, your brain had a really elegant little system going. Something painful happened. Let's say you got rejected, criticized, or failed at something, and your subconscious would immediately kick in with a defense mechanism. Maybe it was denial. That didn't really bother me. Maybe it was rationalization. I didn't want that job anyway. Maybe it was projection. They're just jealous. These mechanisms aren't inherently bad, they're psychological shock absorbers. They let you keep functioning without having to sit in the full emotional weight of every difficult thing that happens to you. But here's the problem with becoming self aware: you can see the defense mechanisms now. You catch yourself mid rationalization and go, wait, I'm doing that thing. And once you see it, you can't fully use it anymore. The illusion breaks. So now, when something painful happens, you actually have to feel it. You have to sit with the discomfort instead of bouncing off it. That's not weakness. That's actually emotional maturity. But it's slower, it's harder, and it costs more energy than just letting your brain autopilot its way through the pain. The takeaway? You're not broken because things hurt more, you're just processing them more honestly. That's the price of clarity. Reason 2: you're constantly aware of the gap between who you are and who you want to be. Psychologists call this the self-discrepancy theory, developed by Edward Higgins in the late 80s. The basic idea is that we all carry around multiple versions of ourselves in our heads: who we actually are, who we think we should be, and who we ideally want to become. The bigger the gap between your actual self and those ideal or ought selves, the more psychological distress you experience. Here's what makes self awareness brutal: you measure that gap more accurately than anyone else. The person who isn't self aware might not even notice the gap. They're not comparing, they're just living. But you see it in high definition all the time. You know where you're falling short. You know what you said in that conversation that you shouldn't have. You know you haven't been disciplined with your goals. You know you're not the parent or the partner or the professional you want to be yet. That constant awareness of the gap is actually motivating you to grow. But it also means you're never fully at rest. You're always measuring. And measuring is tiring. The fix isn't to stop having standards. It's to practice what psychologists call self-compassion, acknowledging the gap without treating it as evidence that you're fundamentally flawed. The gap is not a verdict. It's a direction. Reason 3: you feel responsible for things other people don't even notice. When you're self aware, you start noticing your impact on the world around you. You notice when your energy in a room shifts the dynamic. You notice when your tone of voice made someone tense up. You notice when your choices have downstream consequences for other people. And with noticing comes responsibility, or at least the feeling of responsibility. The person who isn't paying attention doesn't carry that weight because they never picked it up in the first place. But you picked it up the moment you became aware of it. This is especially heavy for people who score high on what psychologists call empathic concern. You don't just see the impact, you feel it. You walk away from a conversation replaying it. You wonder if you did the right thing. You think about how your decisions affect other people, sometimes at the expense of your own peace. This isn't a flaw. This is actually what makes you a good person to have around, but it is genuinely exhausting, and it's worth naming it for what it is. You're carrying moral weight that most people never even pick up. Reason 4, you experience what psychologists call meta emotions. Okay, this one is wild and I love it. Most people feel emotions. Self aware people feel emotions about their emotions. You're anxious, and then you're anxious about being anxious. You're sad, and then you feel guilty for being sad. You're angry, and then you're ashamed of the anger. Researchers call these meta emotions, emotional reactions to your own emotional states, and they are absolutely a feature of high self awareness. The reason this happens is because you're monitoring yourself constantly. You have this internal observer who watches your internal experience and then judges it. Is this feeling appropriate? Is this reaction proportionate? Should I be feeling this? For some people, this creates incredible insight and emotional regulation. But for a lot of highly self aware people, it creates a kind of psychological hall of mirrors. You can't just feel something. You have to observe yourself feeling it, evaluate it, possibly feel something else about it, and then evaluate that. It's exhausting, and it makes simple emotional experiences incredibly complicated. The antidote isn't to stop observing, it's to practice what mindfulness teachers call non judgmental awareness. Notice the feeling. Don't layer judgment on top of it. Just let it be what it is. The feeling doesn't need to be warranted to be valid. It just needs to be felt. Reason 5, you can't stop analyzing social interactions. You know that feeling when you leave a social situation and your brain just starts the post game analysis? Why did I say that? What did they mean by that? Did I come across weird? Was I too much? Not enough? Why did they look at me like that when I said that thing? This is called post event processing, and it's heavily linked to self awareness and social anxiety. It's the mental habit of going back over social interactions and scrutinizing them for flaws, threats, or evidence of how you were perceived. And here's the psychological kicker: this processing is almost always negatively biased. Your brain is not running a balanced review, it's specifically looking for what went wrong. It highlights mistakes, cringes, awkward pauses, and it minimizes everything that went fine. People who aren't self aware just leave the party and move on. They don't run the tape back. But you do, and sometimes you run it back 3 times at 2 a.m. This doesn't mean you're neurotic. It means your brain is highly active in the domain of social self monitoring. The skill to build here is learning to close the loop, setting a mental boundary on when the analysis ends, and consciously redirecting to the present moment. You're allowed to stop reviewing. The game is over. Reason 6, you're more susceptible to existential discomfort. Self awareness doesn't just turn inward, it turns outward toward the big questions. When you start observing yourself honestly, you eventually start asking, why am I doing any of this? What actually matters? What do I actually believe? What is the point? These are not questions that feel good to live with. In fact, psychologists who study existential psychology, thinkers like Irvin Yalom, identify 4 fundamental existential concerns that humans struggle with: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Most people manage these concerns by staying busy, staying distracted, staying inside conventional frameworks that give them pre-packaged answers. But self-aware people tend to push past those frameworks. They question the defaults. And when you question the defaults, you lose the comfort the defaults provide before you've built something more meaningful to replace them. That in-between space is deeply uncomfortable. You've seen too much to go back. You haven't yet built enough to feel secure moving forward. And that gap, and that liminal space, is where a lot of self aware people spend a lot of their time. The work here isn't to find permanent answers, it's to build tolerance for uncertainty and to find meaning in the questions themselves. Reason 7, you hold yourself to standards that exhaust. You self awareness and high personal standards almost always travel together. Because when you're aware of your behavior, your patterns, your motivations, you feel responsible for them. You feel like you should be able to do better because you know better. And that knowing better standard becomes a relentless internal pressure. You catch yourself being reactive and you think, I know why I do this. I've worked on this. I should be past this by now. You procrastinate, and instead of just procrastinating like a normal human, you procrastinate while being fully aware that you're procrastinating and why, which somehow makes it worse. Psychologists call the gap between knowing and doing the intention behavior gap. And for highly self aware people, this gap produces shame in a way it doesn't for people who aren't monitoring themselves as closely. The truth is, insight does not equal instant transformation. Knowing why you do something and being able to consistently change it are two completely separate skills. You're allowed to be a work in progress even when you understand the process perfectly. Understanding the blueprint doesn't build the house overnight. Reason 8, your emotional regulation is more effortful because it has to be conscious. Here's the final piece, and it might be the most counterintuitive one. You'd think that being emotionally self aware would make emotional regulation easier, and in the long run, it does. But in the short run, it's actually harder. Here's why: automatic emotion regulation, the kind that happens unconsciously, is fast, cheap, and effortless. You feel something, your brain runs a habitual response, and you move on. No effort required. But when you're self aware, you interrupt that automatic process. You see the habitual response before it runs, you evaluate it, you decide whether to change it, and then you try to do something different. That process is effortful. It uses what psychologists call executive function, your brain's prefrontal cortex working overtime to override older, faster systems. And executive function is a limited resource. It depletes. It gets tired. So, ironically, the more conscious and intentional you are about managing your emotions, the more mental energy you burn doing it, at least until the new responses become habits themselves. This is why self aware people often feel mentally drained in ways that are hard to explain to people around them. You're not doing less, you're actually doing more. It's just happening inside your head where nobody else can see it. So here's where I want to land with all of this: self awareness is not a mistake, it is not a curse. It is genuinely one of the most valuable things a person can develop. Every single one of the 8 things we talked about today: the loss of defense mechanisms, the self discrepancy gap, the meta emotions, the post event processing, the existential discomfort, the high standards, the effortful regulation. All of them are signs of a person who is growing. But growth has a cost, and too often, the personal development world sells you the benefits without talking about the cost. They tell you awareness is freedom, but they don't tell you it's also weight. You're not doing it wrong if it feels hard, you're doing it honestly. And honest growth is slower, messier, and lonelier than the Instagram version. But it's also the only kind that actually sticks. So, give yourself some credit. Not because you have it figured out, but because you're doing something genuinely difficult. You are choosing to see clearly in a world that makes it very easy to look away. That takes courage. And courage is always hard. If this video hit different for you, drop a comment below and tell me which of these 8 reasons you relate to the most. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's on this path of self discovery and sometimes feels like it's too heavy, share this with them. They need to know they're not alone. Don't forget subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications.